There is a power in this country that lets a law enforcement officer take the cash out of your hands at the side of a road and keep it. No arrests, no charge, no conviction. You are not accused of committing any offense. You are not taken anywhere, and the money is simply gone. The threshold at which that power switches on in Canada is $10,000. That is the figure that triggers the most significant reporting and investigative machinery around cash. But the forfeiture powers that let the state keep your money after taking it sit lower. And the practical reality of how these encounters unfold is something most Canadians have never been told clearly. Most people hear this and imagine drug traffickers, bulk cash in duffel bags, something obviously wrong. The reality is different. $10,000 is a used car purchase in cash, a contractor getting paid on completion of a job who has not been to the bank, someone who does not trust financial institutions, a family driving to a private sale. And none of those people look clean at 11 o'clock at night in a parking lot with an envelope in the glove box, regardless of where every dollar actually came from. I am going to show you what the legal powers actually are in Canada, what the officer is required to give you at the roadside while it is happening, the timelines that run from the moment cash is seized, and the single sentence people say on the street that costs them their money. My name is Jonathan Hale. I am a criminal defense lawyer who has worked in this area for over a decade. This is general information about Canadian law. It is not legal advice, and I am not your lawyer. If your money has already been taken, stop watching and contact a criminal defense lawyer today, because there are deadlines in this area and they are short. And before I take any of this apart, the honest part first, because there is a version of this video that is misleading and it gets shared the most. Criminal cash is real in Canada. It moves through private sales, informal economies, and criminal networks precisely because it cannot enter the banking system without scrutiny. Officers who stop that are doing something legitimate. Most cash seizures are not manufactured. So this is not a video about law enforcement stealing from innocent people. It is a video about being the person who actually is innocent in that conversation and not making it worse with what you say and do in the next 10 minutes. The difference between money that comes back and money that is forfeited is almost never guilt or innocence in any absolute sense. It is what was said at the roadside and what could be proved in the proceeding that followed. Here is the legal framework. In Canada, the seizure and civil forfeiture of cash operates through two parallel streams. The federal stream sits in the Criminal Code of Canada, primarily in Part 12.2, which deals with proceeds of crime. Sections 462.3, 2 through 462.5 govern the restraint and forfeiture of property believed to be proceeds of crime or offense-related property. A judge can issue a restraint order over property, including cash, where there are reasonable grounds to believe that it is proceeds of crime or is property used or intended to be used in the commission of a designated offense. That standard reasonable grounds to believe is higher than bare suspicion, but it is not proof beyond reasonable doubt. And the reach of what qualifies as a designated offense under the proceeds of crime provisions is considerably broader than most people assume. The second stream is provincial civil forfeiture legislation. And this is where the ordinary person is most likely to encounter the power in practice. Every major province in Canada now has its own civil forfeiture regime. Ontario has the Civil Remedies Act, 2001. British Columbia has the Civil Forfeiture Act. Alberta has the Victims Restitution and Compensation Payment Act. Quebec has the act respecting the forfeiture of proceeds and instruments of unlawful activity. And other provinces have equivalent legislation. These provincial regimes are civil proceedings, not criminal ones. They run on a balance of probability standard, not beyond reasonable doubt. The state does not need to prove you committed a crime. It needs to persuade a court on the balance of probabilities that the property is the proceeds of unlawful activity or an instrument of unlawful activity. That distinction is the one that most Canadians have never been told clearly, and that changes everything about how you need to think about this. You are not in a criminal trial. The charter protections that attend a criminal prosecution apply differently and in some cases more weakly in a civil proceeding. The presumption of innocence that protects you in a criminal prosecution does not operate in the same way in a civil forfeiture application. And the burden of making the argument can shift in ways that surprise people. You may need to establish on the evidence that the money came from a lawful source rather than simply asserting that the state has not proved it did not. It is also important to understand that a civil forfeiture application can proceed in parallel with or entirely independently of any criminal investigation or prosecution. Your money can be the subject of a civil forfeiture proceeding, even if you are never charged with any offense. The civil forfeiture regime exists precisely because it does not require the criminal standard of proof, does not require a criminal conviction, and can be pursued regardless of what happens in the criminal stream. Parliament and provincial legislatures created these regimes intentionally as tools that operate differently from the criminal law. Understanding that difference is the most important piece of context for everything else I am about to tell you. Now, the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act, which is the federal legislation that most commonly comes up in cross-border cash encounters. Section 12 of PCMLTFA gives the Canada Border Services Agency authority to require any person arriving in or departing Canada to report cash or monetary instruments of $10,000 or more. The failure to report is itself an offense, and the unreported amount can be seized and forfeited. This is not a proceeds of crime analysis. It is a reporting failure analysis. And it means that entirely lawful money can be forfeited simply because the reporting obligation was not met. What does the officer need to have before any of this begins? This is where your record of the encounter gets built. And building it is the most practical thing you can do while it is happening. For a search for cash under the criminal code or under provincial civil forfeiture powers, there must be legal authority. That authority typically takes the form of a warrant or a warrantless search under a recognized exception. Section 8 of the Charter protects everyone in Canada against unreasonable search and seizure. A warrantless search is presumptively unreasonable under RV. Collins, 1987, and the burden is on the Crown to establish the reasonableness of a warrantless search. Ask what power is being used. Ask whether there is a warrant. If there is, ask to see it. The scope of any search and the scope of any seizure must be justified by the legal instrument authorizing it. The Supreme Court of Canada in RV Grant 2009 confirmed the framework for assessing whether a charter breach occurred and whether the evidence obtained should be excluded under Section 242. The three factors are the seriousness of the charter infringing conduct, the impact of the charter breach on the charter protected interests of the accused, and society's interest in adjudication on the merits. If a search was conducted without lawful authority, everything found in it may be challengeable in the proceedings that follow. But that challenge only exists if there is a record of what happened and a lawyer who knows how to bring it. That record starts with what you write down tonight about what happened at the roadside. For a border encounter under PCML TFA, the authority is different. The reporting obligation sits on the traveler, and the seizure power for failure to report sits in the act itself. But even here, you are entitled to know what is happening to you and why. And you are entitled to a receipt documenting what was taken. Ask for the officer's name and identification. Ask what power is being exercised. Ask for a clear explanation of the grounds for suspicion or the basis for the action. Write all of this down as soon as the encounter ends that same night before you sleep. Your contemporaneous notes matter later. The body camera footage of your encounter is accessible to you under access to information provisions, and requesting it after the fact is worthwhile. But your own notes made immediately are often more detailed and more reliable than footage you recover through a request process months down the line. Now, the timeline, because this is the most misunderstood part of the whole process, and the mistakes people make here are expensive. Under provincial civil forfeiture regimes, the time within which the state must commence forfeiture proceedings after seizing property varies by province. In Ontario, under the Civil Remedies Act, the Civil Remedies Office can seek an interim preservation order from a court, and that order allows the state to hold the property pending a full forfeiture application. There are statutory timelines governing these steps. The forfeiture application itself is a civil proceeding in which you are the respondent or the claimant asserting an interest in the property. In British Columbia and other provinces, equivalent mechanisms exist. The specific timelines differ, and I am not going to quote you numbers for a specific province in a general video, because giving you a wrong number here is more dangerous than not giving you a number at all. What I will tell you clearly is that the deadlines are real, that they run from the date of seizure or the date of the initial court order, and that if you do not act within them, the process moves forward without you, and the outcomes available to you narrow considerably. The process for challenging a provincial civil forfeiture is a civil litigation process. You need to file a response to the forfeiture application. You need to put your evidence before the court, and you need to do so within the time frames the legislation sets out. A lawyer who does this work knows those time frames. You need to know them too, which is why the most useful thing I can tell you about the timeline is call a lawyer the day it happens, not the week after. For border seizures under PCML TFA, there is an administrative process for challenging a seizure and seeking return of the funds. There is also a notice of claim process and an adjudication system. Those processes have their own deadlines. The CBSA will provide you with information about the process and the deadlines at the point of seizure. Read it. Take it seriously. The deadline to file a claim for return of seized cash is not long, and it does not wait for you to finish being upset about what happened. If your cash has been seized today, contact a lawyer today, not this week, today. Now, I want to be specific about who this actually happens to, because the picture in most people's heads is wrong, and the wrong picture stops them preparing. The contractor who finished a renovation and was paid $15,000 in cash by a client who preferred it that way. The person who sold a vehicle privately and is driving home with the proceeds before depositing them. The family driving across a provincial border to buy a recreational vehicle, cash agreed because it was the seller's preference. The older person who has kept savings in cash at home for decades because they grew up in a family that did not trust banks and has not changed that habit. Not one of those people looks obviously innocent at midnight in a service station with $12,000 in an envelope. Every one of them is doing something completely lawful. And the standard that triggers investigation is not proof of criminality. It is reasonable grounds for suspicion, or in the PCML TFA context, simply the presence of the amount. The gap between how it looks and what it is has to be closed by you under pressure in the moment, which is why preparation is the answer, not a clever line. Nobody wins this at the side of a road with a witty response. You win it by being the person who can produce the bank withdrawal slip, the bill of sale, the text message from the seller, the invoice, the receipt, the paperwork that proves the money story before anyone asks you to tell it. Now the sentence that loses people their money. It is almost never a lie. It is almost always a guess. Someone is nervous. They want to be helpful. They cannot remember precisely, and they round it off. Oh, it is about $8,000. It is savings from the last few months, when the actual total is $8,400, and some of it came from selling a piece of equipment in April. Then weeks later, the bank records or the deposit history do not match what they said. Nobody writes that they were flustered on the side of a highway. They write inconsistent account. And an inconsistent account is one of the most useful things the Crown can put before a judge in a civil forfeiture application. It is exactly the grounds they need to argue that the explanation is unreliable and the funds are unexplained. So here is the phrase, said once, calmly, without elaboration, this money is mine. It came from a lawful source, and I will account for it in writing with supporting documents. That sentence does three specific things. It asserts ownership, which is what the forfeiture challenge turns on, because you must be a claimant with an interest in the property to contest the forfeiture. It denies nothing and admits nothing about the specific source in a way that can be checked against your memory under pressure and found inconsistent. And it moves the explanation from a car park at midnight to a desk where you can pull up bank statements, find the invoice, check the date, and be accurate the first time and every time after. Now, let me be specific about what the documentary account actually looks like, because this is the part that most people have only a vague sense of, and that vagueness is a problem. The documentary account of the lawful source of cash is a collection of records that tells the money story in dates and amounts that can be independently verified. For a bank withdrawal, it is the bank statement showing the withdrawal with the date and the amount. For a private sale, it is the bill of sale, the listing if there was one, and any text messages or emails between buyer and seller that confirm the transaction, the agreed price, and the method of payment. For a contractor paid on completion, it is the contract, the invoice, and any documentation of the agreed terms. For savings accumulated over time, it is the deposit history and the withdrawal history, showing where the money came from and how it moved. What the documentary account is not is a story you tell verbally at the roadside and then try to support with paper later. The story told verbally at the roadside under pressure and the paper produced weeks later during a legal challenge have to match precisely. Not approximately, not close enough, precisely. Any discrepancy any date that is slightly off, any amount that rounds differently, any transaction that cannot be found in the records becomes the grounds for an inconsistency argument that the state will use. The written account, prepared carefully at a desk with the records in front of you, by definition matches the records. The verbal account given in a parking lot under stress, by definition, risks not matching them. That is why the roadside phrase commits to the written account and defers the explanation. Not because you have something to hide, because accuracy matters more than speed, and accuracy requires your records. This money is mine. Ownership is the foundation of every challenge to a civil forfeiture order. Under the Provincial Civil Forfeiture Acts, you have standing to contest the forfeiture only if you claim an interest in the property. Asserting ownership at the roadside is not a legal step in the forfeiture process. It is a piece of the narrative that the officer records and that shapes the file that gets to the next level. Asserting it clearly is better than leaving the ownership question open. If the money actually belongs to someone else and you are carrying it for them, that person needs to know immediately, and they need to be part of the response, because their documentation of the source is as important as yours. It came from a lawful source. This is the key statement in the civil forfeiture context. The balance of probabilities standard under the provincial regimes means the state needs to establish that the money more likely than not represents the proceeds of unlawful activity. Your statement that it came from a lawful source goes into the record. It does not close the inquiry, but it creates a starting point for the documentary account that you are promising to provide. And I will account for it in writing with supporting documents. This sentence does the work that saves the most people. It commits you to the explanation without requiring you to give the explanation accurately from memory in a high-stress situation at the side of a road. And the promise of documentary support is not a bluff. It means you actually need to have or be able to obtain the documentary support. The bank statement showing the withdrawal, the receipt from the sale, the invoice, the message from the buyer, the payment record from the contract. Dull, dated, checkable paper beats any clever thing you could say at the roadside. Consistently, while it is happening, do these things. Ask for the officer's name and badge or identifier. Ask what power is being exercised specifically. Ask whether there is a warrant, and if so, ask to see it. If cash is being counted, make sure the amount recorded is accurate and that you are given a receipt recording the amount taken. If you are not given documentation at the scene, note the time and ask when you will receive it. Write everything down as soon as the encounter ends, and then contact a lawyer today, not to see how things develop, because the timeline starts from the seizure date and the steps in the forfeiture process begin moving while you are still processing what happened. The questions I am asked most often about this: can I refuse to let them count the money? In practice, no. If a lawful search is being conducted and cash is being seized under proper authority, obstructing that process is a separate problem under Section 129 of the Criminal Code. What you can and should do is ask what power is being exercised, make sure the amount is recorded accurately, and get a receipt. A disputed amount is an extremely unpleasant thing to argue about later when everyone's memory of the figure is different. Do I need a lawyer? Yes, early. This is a specialist area of practice. Civil forfeiture litigation is different from criminal defense work, although there are often criminal dimensions. Many firms that do civil forfeiture work offer initial consultations And that first call is the most important one. Do not wait to see what the state does next. By the time the first court date arrives in the civil proceeding, the shape of the argument has already been set. You want to be part of setting it. What if the officer tells me I can have it back right now if I just explain where it came from? Then explain that you will account for it in writing and ask for that assurance to be recorded. Roadside promises are not court orders. The person making the promise on the street is often not the person who makes the decision in the proceeding that follows. An account you give voluntarily at the roadside under pressure, even an accurate one, can be used against you if any detail is later found to be inconsistent with the records. The written account, made carefully with your records in front of you, is the one that matters. What if the money was not entirely mine? Some of it was a friend's. Then your friend has an interest in the property, and your friend needs to be part of the response. The documentation supporting the portion of the funds that came from your friend needs to come from your friend and needs to be consistent with your account of the situation. Multiple claimants complicate the process, but do not end it. Should I just never carry large amounts of cash? That is not the lesson this video is meant to leave you with. The lesson is that if you are moving a meaningful amount of cash, carry the story with it. A screenshot of the bank withdrawal, the text confirming the sale, the invoice, 60 seconds of preparation that documents the source before anyone asks. That preparation is the difference between an encounter that is resolved in days and one that takes months and costs money to fix. And the one line you do not cross. On this topic, it carries more weight than on almost any other. Saying little at the roadside while promising a documented account is lawful, and it is the move that protects you. But providing a fabricated explanation of where the money came from is an offense under Section 366 of the Criminal Code if it involves a false document, and potentially under money laundering provisions if the fabrication is part of concealing a criminal source. And producing paperwork that is not genuine turns a civil argument you were likely going to win into a criminal matter you almost certainly will not. The honest, boring documentary trail is the one that works every time. And the last question, the one I save for the end because it is the one the closing thought belongs to. Should you just never carry significant cash? No. That is not the lesson, and it is not a country any of us should accept. The lesson is that if you are moving a meaningful amount of cash in Canada, carry the story with it, not a prepared explanation for the officer. The documentation, the bank withdrawal slip saved in your phone, the screenshot of the text from the buyer, the invoice from the job, 60 seconds of preparation before you leave the house, put in the glove box or on your phone, closes most of the gap between how an innocent encounter looks and what it actually is. That preparation is the difference between a situation that resolves in days because the paper is available immediately and one that takes months and thousands of dollars in legal fees to resolve because the paper had to be assembled after the fact under adversarial conditions. Here is the complete picture. In Canada, civil forfeiture of cash can proceed without a criminal charge, conviction, or even arrest. The standard in provincial regimes is balance of probabilities. The timeline runs from the date of seizure. You are the claimant who must assert your interest in a proceeding that the state initiates. The documentation of the lawful source of the funds is the central battleground.